Até os mais céticos quanto a alterações do clima na Terra aceitam que mudanças tenham ocorrido de fato, desde a frequência maior de desastres naturais ao aumento médio da temperatura no planeta. A controvérsia surge quando se discute a causa. Seria a própria natureza, atravessando uma de suas fases, como as que no passado de séculos provocaram o frio excessivo da Idade do Gelo, explosões vulcânicas monumentais, distúrbios na superfície do Sol, destruição maciça de espécies como os dinossauros? Ou a culpa é do ser humano? Em saga destruidora, consciente ou não, quando devora os recursos da Terra, polui o ar, solo e mar, na ânsia de produzir mais, buscar uma vida melhor. A maioria dos cientistas já fez sua escolha pela segunda explicação. E muitos pregam a necessidade de corrigir os erros para ao menos aliviar os danos e proteger gerações futuras. Por este caminho, concluiu a mega conferência em Paris no fim de 2015, com metas para reduzir as práticas que tanto prejudicam o meio ambiente, como o uso de combustíveis fósseis. Em 2016, surge um estudo científico que não só endossa a interpretação de que o homem é responsável pelos danos ao planeta, mas ousa concluir que a destruição atingiu o ponto crítico e não se limita apenas a um efeito sobre o ar e a superfície. Já constituiria o início de uma nova era geológica, que, por ter o homem como agente maior da interferência danosa no planeta, ganharia o nome de Antropoceno. O Antropoceno substituiria a era anterior, chamada de Holoceno, existente há 12 mil anos, desde o fim do período glacial no planeta. O milênio foi ao Centro Britânico de Estudos Geológicos, no interior da Inglaterra, para encontrar o autor do estudo, recém-publicado na revista Science, o geólogo Colin Waters, que, em meio a amostras de rochas e fósseis com milhões de anos de existência, nos falou sobre o Antropoceno.
Other than amongst the eccentric climate change deniers and a few people with strange thoughts, it's not hard to find acceptance of the idea that man is interfering with nature quite a bit. Many scientists, many lay people agree with that. But to go from there to saying that the man interference in nature is leading us to a new geological phase, the Anthropocene, that's quite a jump. Mm-hmm. Is there any evidence for that?
Certainly lots of distinct physical evidence, and what we were tasked to do as part of the Anthropocene Working Group was to really look through all of the different environmental signatures and say, have we really as a species changed that planet so much that we're creating a set of deposits which are completely distinct from deposits that accumulated beforehand? And certainly we feel that we've found enough of these signals, the changes we've made, to make it a justifiable statement to say this is a different planet to the one we lived in maybe 50 or 60 years ago.
Is the Anthropocene epoch already here, or is it coming?
No, we think that having looked at the evidence, there certainly seems to be, there is very good evidence to say that humans have affected the environment for thousands of years. But that's something that's happened gradually, and the impetus and the focus of that change has been perhaps more centred on the Middle East and gradually spread out with time. So it's a very slow progress. And what we're really recognising is a lot of the major signals, the ones that you see across the whole planet, are all starting to align towards the middle of the 20th century. And we feel that the big changes that have happened to our planet have all happened really around about that time, so 60 or 70 years ago. And so, though it's not our final decision at this stage, it's still a work in progress, it's still discussion within the group, many of us are starting to feel that the evidence is very strong for the middle of the 20th century.
And from a formal point of view, it still has to go through some organizations
Yes,
to actually
certainly.
approve the fact that we are...
The process at this stage is that we as a working group will discuss this. We will probably have a formal statement to make later on this year in Cape Town at a congress. But that will be just a position statement to say this is how far we've got with the discussion. But it certainly won't be the formal decision.
Antropoceno foi tema de uma amostra do recém-inaugurado Museu do Amanhã, no Rio de Janeiro.
O Antropoceno pode ser entendido como um momento em que muda a escala da presença humana no planeta. E a partir de 1950, essa aceleração ela aumentou muito. Eu comparo que a grande transformação que veio acontecendo com a Revolução Industrial é como se fosse uma ventania que em meados do século XX se transforma num furacão. Então, em meados do século XX nós tínhamos 3 bilhões de pessoas e 40 milhões de veículos motorizados no planeta. E agora, 60 anos depois, nós temos 7 bilhões de pessoas e mais de 1 bilhão de veículos.
So the 7 billion of us are, and pretty soon to be 9, 10 billion. Yeah. What we're doing, we're actually changing the way the world works.
Yes.
Nature works.
The last epoch, the Holocene, started 11,700 years ago. That was the end of the last ice age. There was estimated to be about 2 million people on the whole planet at that time, spread across the whole planet. So take a reasonable-sized city, probably in Brazil, you've got many cities bigger than that. How much influence they could have on the changing of the environment of the planet, it would have been moderately small. And certainly the changes that happened at the end of the Ice Age were not human-driven. They were totally natural. But we benefited from that change, and particularly the increase in temperatures, the warming of the environment that happened. And really over the last 10,000 years or so, we've had stability, and that's what we've prospered from, is the fact that the environment hasn't changed dramatically. It's not been swinging from cold to hot. So we've been able to develop our civilization. We've built the cities, we've as you say, cultivated, domesticated animals. So we've been able to take advantage of our resources.
Until all of a sudden we started to fool around with it.
The question now is that can we keep supporting that high level of consumption with 9 billion people on the planet, all striving to have a wonderful existence? And why shouldn't they? I mean, everyone wants to have, to live till they're 80 or 90 years old, and to live as any American or a British person would want to live. So it's very hard to say you shouldn't be doing this.
Besides the usually malign use of fossil fuels, oil, gas, and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we all associated that with doing damage, man doing damage to nature. But you're actually referring to things that we normally don't associate with that. Too much plastic, too much concrete.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
So one of the things that we're trying to do with the study was to say we will look at various natural signatures. These are things that would happen naturally. And things like climate change is a natural process to some extent as well. Temperatures do fluctuate. But what we wanted to do also was to recognize things that were wholly Anthropocene in its origin. It was produced by man and moderately recently. And so examples such as plastic really invented about the turn of the beginning of the 1900s. We have things like Bakelite, which was a material that was used for radios, but on a very small scale. And it wasn't really until about the 1950s that this whole explosion in different types of plastics developed.
Plastic is broken down into microscopic parts. These plastic particles can absorb high concentrations of agricultural and industrial toxins. Many animals mistake the plastic for plankton and eat their fill. Every year, more than 100,000 turtles, marine mammals and seabirds die a slow and painful death because they starve with a full stomach or because their intestines rupture. Other marine creatures in whose cells plastic and toxins have accumulated end up as seafood on our plates.
It does damage everywhere, not only the countries that produce the plastic.
The interesting thing with plastic is that with many of the things that we've produced, and we also talk about aluminium and we talk about concrete, they tend to be things that we have around us. So it's within our landscape that we live in. Plastics, similarly, you're sort of familiar with the fact that we have bits of plastic flying around in the wind and landfill sites full of plastic. What you don't tend to think about is those invisible aspects of plastic. So there are things like microbeads, so micron-sized particles of plastic which go in your toothpaste or go into cosmetics or facial scrubs, that sort of thing. And also, when clothes like this, artificial fibres, when you wash your clothes, maybe as much as 1,000 fragments of artificial plastic material, in effect, gets washed from your clothes and goes through the sewage system out into the rivers, then flows out into the oceans, and is starting to accumulate on the ocean floors. And also, it's fairly familiar now, we have these big gyres of plastic floating around in the middle of the oceans in a big swirl, a big whirlpool. These are being consumed by animals. Eventually, they're working their way down to the seabed, and really no one knows how long they will persist into the geological record. There's an assumption that certainly at the surface, because they're exposed to ultraviolet light, they'll break down. Eventually, they'll fragment and they'll gradually disappear. But what we don't know is how long they'll persist when they're buried at depths of several hundreds or thousands of meters in the oceans.
And similar situation with concrete, although obviously concrete doesn't float.
Yeah.
But it's totally man-made.
Totally man-made. Has been around since Roman times, but generally on a small scale. And it wasn't until around about the Second World War that it became the building material of choice. And so now we're creating incredible amounts of concrete. Again, we have an estimate that if you took all the concrete that's ever been produced, it would equate to about 1 kilogram per square meter across the whole planet. That's land and sea. So the amount of materials we're excavating from the ground, for minerals, for aggregates, for making the concrete, if you total those all together, it's at least 3 times more than all of the material being eroded and transported by rivers. All of the signals that we're looking at are ones that we think are going to be preserved way, way into the future, so that a geologist in a million or more years' time will be able to see these changes and say, something created that. They may not even know what caused that change, but actually it's something that happened very quickly across the planet, and we know it's our legacy. It's what we've created and how we've changed the planet.
To go into another aspect of the man's interference in nature, there was a comment recently by scientist Steve Hawkins. He mentioned that human beings run the risk of facing dangers created by us, from nuclear war to global warming and genetically engineered viruses. And he says, and you know, he's a firm believer in science, of course, and he says that progress in science and technology will create new ways for things to go wrong. Is that pretty much that fits into your concept?
Is it the scientists that cause the problems, or the politicians? It's not for me to comment on that. But at the same time, I'm sort of a firm believer that having looked at the way that the 7 billion of us are changing the planet, that we have an incredible power to make change. And when we decide to do something, that change happens very quickly and potentially globally. And I suppose you may say we're damaging the planet, and that's an opinion. But we have the ability to change things the opposite way. And I think some of the signals that we're seeing already, actually, you mentioned about fallout from nuclear testing. That's a good example of where initially it was uncontrolled, and we had a very rapid dispersal of radiogenic materials, plutonium as an example, uranium, spread right across the planet so that we can actually recognize it in sediments now. Really, that signature didn't become particularly apparent until about 1952, when the big thermonuclear devices were set off. But it became apparent, if it wasn't apparent to them originally, it became apparent very quickly that this material was starting to collect on the surface. So they decided to do the testing underground. And almost immediately, from about 1964 onwards, that signature starts to decrease because all the detonations were underground. And then eventually they started to have a moratorium on detonations, all full stop. So we have an ability to realize the problem and make a change.
Talking about species, you know, as we know through the ages, species get extinguished by so many different reasons. But there's also a big reason, man's interference with species that and destroying them. Is that happening faster now, to distinguish?
Certainly it's believed by a lot of researchers that the rate of increase has increased. Initially, there are things like with the Columbian era, where we had the sort of the Spanish and Portuguese conquests of the Americas, that there was a mass transfer of species, animals, but also plant species. So we're starting to see that first stage of homogenizing all of the species. There's something that's progressed very rapidly in the mid-20th century, really. We're now in a world where we can transport things around the planet very rapidly. We like to consume the same sorts of food. We have the same domesticated animals. It's been estimated that about 96% of all of the vertebrate mass is either us as humans or our domesticated species. So there's not much room left for wildlife in that equation.
Well, we're talking about species disappearing. One way that we nowadays come into contact with species that have disappeared are fossils.
Yes.
Your profession is quite closely involved in that, in the geological search. You get into fossils and discover these species no longer exist. Let's look into the future. And even if the human species is still around, or somebody from outer space comes and finds fossils of our time, what are they going to find? Plastic?
Yeah.
What are they going to think?
The issue about fossils is interesting because obviously that's how, as geologists, we tend to try and subdivide geological time. It's looking at evolution of species. But it's a very slow process generally. Too slow for us to perhaps use for defining the Anthropocene because things don't evolve that quickly. Things don't tend to become extinct that quickly. So we're going to have to look perhaps at a different approach, which is something we call technofossils. So in effect, it's the things that you and I are familiar with. It's the biros, it's the CDs. These are the things that are evolving very quickly. And when something gets invented, like a CD, cell phones as well. I mean, we go from a point a few decades ago where no one would have had a cell phone, and now everybody has one. So there's the potential there to create a great diversity of different types of fossils, but ones that, if everybody has them, the abundance is unbelievable. So these can be the things that we could use as our fossil markers in the future to see. And one of the great things about some of these is that things like our plastic we talked about earlier, if they've got a barcode on them, or if they've got a date stamp saying used by, we actually have a date stamp to tell us how old those fossils are, which is something that the old paleontologists would never have. You would never find a dinosaur board telling you how old it is.
Yeah. And this proverbial being from, let's say, another civilization, coming from outer space and finding these fossils, what would they think was our times were all about?
Whether they would actually comprehend how these were made, what actually goes into making these materials. I think one of the things about fossils is that what you don't tend to do is preserve the actual physical body. So if you think about plastic as an example, that no doubt will degrade with time to go back to its original state, which is the hydrocarbons that sourced the plastic. But what you will do is preserve the whole that material would disintegrate from. So that's what fossils are. Fossils aren't the actual organic remains of that animal. It's where that animal gets replaced by minerals to create, in effect, a stone imitation of the original organism. And in many cases, what we'll be seeing are fossils which are not the cell phone itself, but probably the shape of the cell phone replaced by some sort of mineral or rock. And that's going to be a very confusing thing to someone look at and say, what could create that strange oblong shape with little buttons on it? But they won't necessarily be able to analyse it and say, we can work out that this was some way of communicating with people.
Or significantly, perhaps, what kind of beings were around creating these things? What kind of civilization that has disappeared, obviously, because all that has become fossil.
This is obviously a problem that archaeologists have had to live with for thousands of years. I mean, looking back thousands of years' time, that they find objects and have to try and work out, because they're not used now, how would they use that? It's not a new problem, but I think it's becoming a more diverse technological problem, because these things are being promulgated, and they last for short periods of time as well. Things that I always think of things like floppy disks that I started using when I first used a computer, and you never see them anymore.
I guess even the younger generation today, you show them a floppy disk, they wouldn't know what kind of entity is that. Like a typewriter, or a turntable for records. But going back to the Anthropocene as a general concept, let's try a value judgment here. Do you find the Anthropocene epoch or era a reason for despair or hope?
A lot of the signals that we recognise would be considered to be detrimental changes to the environment, and so that makes us realise what impact we as a species have on the planet. Perhaps the hope can be that we've realised that. In many cases, and let's take dinosaurs as an example, they've become extinct, but they didn't really have much control over that extinction. They were just party to it. You could argue that if we carry on the way we are, that we could cause our own extinction. But as a species, the fact that we're cognitive about this, we know that that's what's happening to the environment. We have the ability to change. And again, when 7 billion people decide to change, we can make that something that can be a very positive thing. So I shouldn't feel that we have to be necessarily despairing about this. And of course, again, I go back to the fact that we are talking in our paper about the past record. And it's important that information is made available to everybody so that we can realise how we do affect the environment. And it's not just climate change, but it's across the board. It's the effects we have on the oceans, on the atmosphere, on glaciers, ice itself. These are things that we do have a control over to some extent.
Colin Waters, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.